You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday the 20th of December 2013. Rochdale sex grooming gangs able to flourish due to police errors, says report. Colourblind social workers couldn't see glaring racial issues to Rochdale sex abuse. Can Abramovich make my Christmas wish for the BBC come true? Most European Muslims want Sharia. European Union stripped of AAA credit rating at S&P. 1,000 migrants trying to get into Malila pushed back. Black mob violence blamed on collective mental illness. Cockroaches, the new miracle cure for China's ailments. War on Christmas is more like war on Christians in many parts of the world. Thought for the day, failures? What failures? And finally, it's even on the web now. UK news. Rochdale sex grooming gangs able to flourish due to police errors, say report. A catalogue of police failures allowing sex grooming gangs to flourish in Rochdale, according to a damning leaked report that is published on Friday. Among the failings identified in the 300-page report, untrained detectives were used to investigate child exploitation and there was a lack of resources and oversight. The serious case review was announced by Rochdale Council last year after 9 Asian men were convicted of a systematic grooming and sexual abuse of white girls in Greater Manchester. The findings of the review have resulted in an acknowledgement by Greater Manchester Police that the force has let down a number of vulnerable girls who were groomed by gangs for sexual abuse. An internal police investigation highlighted in the serious case review also found a failure to recognise abuse. The internal police review found that officers failed to challenge a Crown Prosecution Service decision not to prosecute. There was a lack of resources and managerial support for the investigations, initially led by CID, despite formal requests. Detectives without training in child sexual exploitation were used to interview potential victims. There was a lack of managerial oversight for investigations in 2008 and 2009. There was a lack of strategies to respond to frequent runaways, which allowed them to return to their abusers. There was recognition that there may have been discriminatory attitudes among police officers towards the victims. But despite the list of acknowledged problems, the police made just one recommendation, that the Force's Public Protection Division should ensure continued participation in Project Phoenix, which has been set up to direct a multi-agency approach to child sexual exploitation in the region. World at 8, which is a complete waste of time and money if the authorities never truly recognise which section of society is responsible. Colourblind social workers couldn't see glaring racial clues to Rochdale sex abuse. A dangerous inability to recognise the importance of race meant social workers and police missed glaring warning signs about a gang of Pakistani men grooming white girls for sex in Rochdale, an official inquiry has concluded. An obsession with being colourblind meant they failed even to notice the pattern of abuse going on under their noses, it found. Although they carefully documented a spate of young white girls from troubled backgrounds in relationships with older men from a community they rarely otherwise mix with, no one questioned what was going on, it said. Had they asked why so many vulnerable white girls were striking up friendships with older Asian men, they would have been able to stop the abuse much earlier, a serious case review finds. The report, focusing on 6 of the victims at the centre of one of the biggest child protection scandals of recent times, concluded that a large part of the abuse could have been predicted and prevented if basic questions had been asked. The report found no direct evidence that professionals willfully ignored the problem out of political correctness. But it concludes that a baffling failure even to think about the racial element meant they missed some of the most obvious warning signs. It also found evidence that class played a role in the failings. It said an army of professionals who dealt with the victims simply accepted what would otherwise be seen as telltale signs of sexual exploitation as being girls making lifestyle choices which fitted what was expected of them given their background. World at 8. Troubled, vulnerable, Asian, what haven't we heard before? The P word for just once, Pakistani of course, just not Muslim. Do they actually pay people for these reports? Money for old jam, innit? They should print them in Urdu and Pushtu and give them out to the Muslim communities. Can Abramovich make my Christmas wish for the BBC come true? Roman Abramovich has been quick to stamp on a story that the billionaire has tapped up Adele to perform at his lavish New Year's Eve party. The Skyfall singer would be offered a windfall to sing at the Caribbean Bash, which last year cost £5 million and attracted guests including George Lucas and Daniel Craig, according to reports. John Mann, Abramovich's press secretary, immediately took to Twitter. Official tweet at the Sun newspaper story on Adele and Abramovich holiday party totally false. Daniel Sanford, the BBC Moscow's correspondent, challenged Abramovich's man. Perhaps the real story was Chelsea billionaire too broke to have New Year party. He tweeted. Mann replied, ha ha, just for that I would advise him to buy your TV channel and close it. At a starting price of around £9 billion, to 2 revenues being the current going rate for media M&A deals, the BBC would presumably be a snip for Abramovich. World at 8, oh, if only. European news. Most European Muslims want Sharia. A majority of Muslims want Sharia law to take precedence over the secular laws of their European host countries. This according to a new survey, WZB Berlin Social Science Centre, based on interviews with Muslims in 6 countries, including Sweden. The survey ought to raise eyebrows amongst Western politicians, say researchers. Turkish and Moroccan immigrants to Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Holland and Sweden were asked 3 questions. Is Sharia more important to you than the laws of the land you are living in? Yes, 66%. Do you think there is only one legitimate interpretation of the Quran that should be binding on all Muslims? Yes, 75%. Do you think Muslims ought to return to the Islam's roots? Yes, 60%. Those who answered yes to all questions were labelled consistent fundamentalists, and they make up 44% of all Muslims covered by the survey. Fundamentalist attitudes are equally prevalent amongst young and older Muslims. World at 8. This is the writing on the wall and should be a warning to continuing immigration from Islamic countries to Europe, so wanted by the EU and the School of Common Purpose. European Union stripped AAA credit rating at S&P. The European Union lost its top credit rating from Standard & Poor's, which cited the deteriorating creditworthiness of the bloc's 28 member nations. S&P cut its long-term rating on the EU to AA+, with a stable outlook from AAA, and maintained its short-term rating at A-1+. The downgrade came after S&P last month lowered its AAA rating on the Netherlands. Ratings remain under pressure more than 4 years after the outbreak of the European debt crisis, which led the EU to offer emergency financing to Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain and Cyprus to shore up their bonds and banks. A lack of cohesion and solidarity amongst EU member states, particularly regarding the budget process, poses a credit risk, S&P said in today's statement. 1,000 migrants trying to get into Melilla pushed back. About 1,000 migrants of sub-Saharan origins tried but failed to get over a 6-metre tall border fence that separates Morocco from the Spanish-held North African territory of Melilla on Tuesday night. Spanish and Moroccan security forces pushed the migrants walking in a single file line back, with the Moroccan ones, according to sources from the government delegation of the autonomous city, making use of a helicopter to disperse the migrants and stop them from approaching the double-layer border barrier. Around 11:30 p.m, Guardia Civil officers sighted the massive group of migrants coming down from the Mount Gurugu in Moroccan territory, where hundreds are camped out to await a suitable moment to try to climb over the high border fence. World news. Black mob violence blamed on collective mental illness. Wilmington, Delaware has a big problem. Large groups of black people are going crazy, and this collective mental illness is causing record levels of crime and gun violence in this mostly black town of 70,000 people. That is the official diagnosis of the City Council, which, by unanimous agreement earlier this month, asked the Centres for Disease Control to investigate a wave of psychological mayhem that has turned this historic and once charming city into an unrecognisable husk of its former self. World at 8. That is what happens when you get all the blacks together. Mass hysteria and cruelty. That is why Africa, which apparently was the source of so-called civilization, had not progressed in thousands of years, except in areas where the Europeans colonised. Proof of pudding in eating. Cockroaches, the new miracle cure for China's ailments. The cockroach, whose innards resemble cottage cheese, has an earthly taste with a slight twinge of ammonia. But they have become popular in China not for their taste, but for their medicinal benefits. They really are a miracle drug, said Liu Yuxiang, a professor at the Shandong Agricultural University and head of Shandong Province's Insect Association. They can cure a number of ailments and they work much faster than other medicine. World at 8. I give up with this lot. They're even using cockroaches for medicine. Exactly what ailments do they cure and how? That would be interesting to know. I feel sorry for the poor roaches. They're probably being examined alive, as we know what the Chinese like to do with all forms of non-human life, don't we? War on Christmas is more like war on Christians in many parts of the world. Juan Williams of FoxNews.com asks if there is war on Christmas. The bigger question is about a war on Christians. As part of America's Christian majority, I have never been threatened or persecuted for my faith in Jesus as God in the flesh, but I have had to make the case for my beliefs. Atheists have dismissed me as delusional. They say there is no Son of God, and I disagree. Agnostics who see no evidence of God have misunderstood me. I have faith. And I argue with people who object to manger scenes and the Christian cross on public land as violation the legal divide between church and the government. I think people of all faiths can reach agreement on reasonable, limited displays of religious symbols without offending anyone. Let us give each other the gift of awareness this Christmas to the real persecution of Christians around the globe. But even as we debate religion in American life, we cannot forget a bigger threat, the violent global war on Christians. Here are some of the worst examples of Christian persecution around the world. An American Christian pastor has been in an Iranian prison for more than a year. The US State Department has confirmed he is jailed on charges related to his religious beliefs. Saeed Ebedinini set up churches in that country for almost a decade, and the government found his work threatening. In Egypt, fundamentalist Muslims regularly attack Coptic Christians. A House Foreign Affairs subcommittee heard testimony last week on the sad plight of the Copts. Bishop Angelos of the Coptic Orthodox Church of Britain spoke of an unprecedented wave of violence erupting against Christians that is being carried out by radical elements in society. And in Syria there are reports of Christians in the northern part of the country being targeted for rape, kidnapping and murder by Muslim groups. Christian churches have been vandalised throughout the country as civil war has torn the country apart for the last 2 years. The civil war has forced thousands of Christians to flee the country in droves, seeking refuge in neighbouring countries. The British Parliament debated this worldwide persecution of Christians earlier this month. One member of Parliament called it the biggest story in the world that has never been told. Earlier this week, nations around the world marked International Human Rights Day. Let's not forget that the right to worship freely without fear of persecution is not only an American constitutional right, it is also guaranteed by that United Nations in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This holiday season I'm asking American Christians to pray for fellow Christians who live under the threat of violence in other parts of the world because they dare to stand up for Jesus. And let us give each other the gift of awareness this Christmas to the real persecution of Christians around the globe. One act of love that all Americans, Christians, Jews, Muslims, agnostics and atheists can agree on is that our nation must be a light to the world as we stand for religious freedom everywhere. World at 8. I just wish a prominent British broadcaster would make the same statement, or even the Queen, but as her son wants to be known as defender of all faiths, that is unlikely. There are times I'm ashamed to be English and British. Why can't the British public see what's happening in the rest of the world instead of encouraging it on their own home territory? Christmas and Christians are an endangered species. Well, as far as I'm concerned, Ramadan, Eid, Diwali or anything not white, Christian or English can go F itself. and so can the English people who accommodate these foreign holidays with their two-faced attitudes. Someone, somewhere, apart from the British National Party, must stand up and be counted. No one respects weakness or ignorance, and we Brits are both. Challenge your local shops as to why they are not celebrating Christmas. You might be surprised at the answers you get. Thought for the day. Failures? What failures? What failures, you may say, and most of them are facing you in the papers, matey. The Guardian, of course, is well up there, making the plods feel even worse than they should be, with an article on the failures of the police in regards to the Rochdale Asian grooming gangs, etc. Well, the first two glaring failures on that paper is part of the reference to the Asian groomers and the vulnerable girls, alias the old tales from years ago, reinvented by the media and now taken up by the plods. No, the most disgusting failure is that this rhetoric is old and untrue, as we've said on many, many occasions. The second most disgusting thing is that the sheeples will read this and the reporting on these ongoing crimes will go no further, which is the intention. The third is that it was because of most of these reports of abuse came from people who live on council estates, which is truly awful. When the media and the Muslims run out of children from care homes, they target the kids on council estates, and it shows that this isn't as random or infrequent as the media or the plods like to think, or in fact even the Guardian. I'm tired of rules not applying to Muslims who operate a hate-thinking campaign all the time, and the past master of this is Anjem Chowdhury, Britain's most eminent hate preacher who also lives on benefits. Chowdhury has hit the news again just as he intended, this time for marching down Brick Lane threatening shopkeepers with 40 lashes if they don't stop selling alcohol. At the same time he's gone on record acclaiming Muslim gangs who recently attacked non-Muslims in what they call a Sharia zone, but which is still in fact our country, not theirs, as doing the right thing for Allah. The right thing for our God is to get rid of him, his family, his dependents, his mosques and a vast majority of his people who should go where they're happiest and as far away from the UK and Europe as is possible without going to the moon or shuffling off this mortal coil. That is my Christmas message to you, Chowdhury, and yours. I'm sick of lies and downright untruths put out in the name of news in this country. I'm also sick and tired of the Lee Rigby fiasco. Not for his family, of course, in their terrible loss and the way it was brought about, but the fuss and bother and publicity those two murdering bastards have got throughout this trial. All the films shown of their bloodied hands were whited out until yesterday when they were pronounced guilty in 90 minutes and which were shown in all their gory glory last night on ITV. Also a fact that's been making me seethe for months and which has not been addressed by any of the media or even courts to my knowledge, and that is the black and Asian enrichers of this part of town in which this act occurred stood and looked on whilst a young white guy was decapitated and filmed it. You might have noticed most of these walked away past the official cameras when Lee was well dead, and the two scroats were walking about giving their voice to their opinions in a clearly listening audience. Another point is, if all these enrichers stood by and watched, why didn't the news pick this up instead of highlighting the two middle-aged white women who approached the scene when all was finished? They weren't brave, they were curious, but apart from that fact, no one black or Asian person even approached their countrymen, did they? You aren't telling me that a couple of hefty Negroes, if one is allowed to call them that now, couldn't have floored those two before they committed what is in fact two premeditated acts. One running over with intent to kill and two partial decapitation. Why hasn't the media even mentioned that fact? And without harping on, anyone can wear a Help for Heroes t-shirt, so how did these two retards know what Lee was? It doesn't bode well for us if they went by the colour of his skin, which of course they did, as there are plenty of black army guys as well in Woolwich, so the prosecution should have added race hate crime to the sheet. And another thing which makes me hopping mad is that when these two blacks ran at the plods armed to the teeth, why didn't plods shoot to kill? After all, they shoot to kill every other white guy armed with machetes, even if they're certified insane. But maybe that is a white thing as well. After all, one couldn't have a Stephen Lawrence moment again, could we? So these two self-admitted and recorded on hordes of their countrymen's phones murderers actually went to trial, which has cost us thousands of pounds if not millions, and they will get life, or what passes for life, and we, the taxpayers, will be feeding these two for the next 30 odd years, together with their families on benefits and of course the prison where they will be fated amongst the Muslim criminals there and probably given a very easy life, with prayer mats and computers and law courses for them to take. To say nothing of the very costly appeals which will dominate their sentence and the bloody media. Deport them back to Africa to serve their life sentences there. But of course, if that happens, they could be let out in 20 odd years and made prime ministers of that region. Oh God, another Mandela. In fact, two of them. Nope, don't like the Chinese version of the justice system much, but for these two it would have been better and cheaper to us and given Lee's family more closure, and the bullets would have been sent to both Africans' families for payment. I love it. Now I know the New World Order is in full swing in this country when I listened to Cameron stating his take on the Rigby debacle, when he said all extremist groups must be watched, and he wasn't referring to just Muslim extremist groups, was he? Oh no, he was referring to the nationalist groups especially, because Moron Chops doesn't view the Muslims as a problem, even radicalised ones. He doesn't view the communists and socialists as a problem, and he doesn't view the unions as a problem. He doesn't view Millipede's Labourite red sections. No, that was addressed to extremist groups, and he didn't name anything, which of course is suspect in itself. So, we are being watched, boys and girls. Well, that's no real change, is it? However, I am a believer in the fact that when rules and regs are made, they should be for everybody or against everyone, and not singled out for one particular political bias or party. To heap coals of indignation in the media and completely miss out the main points of those happenings is not only bad journalism, it is biased journalism in the extreme, and that is what we have today. A blinkered and dangerous media which the sheeples believe, or at least don't question, and it is the sheeples who might get off their arses to vote. So how dangerous is that? Put that with your already highly enriched main cities and large towns, and any form of national pride in voting is seriously endangered. When you hear your own Prime Minister avoiding the obvious and highlighting the so-called unspeakable, you know your country is in grave danger from within. You know that the machinations of the EU and the New World Order are in full view, so don't ignore them and don't fall into their traps. Think and do for yourselves is the only answer, and remember, the British National Party thought of everything first. And finally, it is even on the web now. I don't believe it. I simply do not believe it. I apologise if this offends some of my more sensitive listeners, but I simply could not 1, believe this, or 2, not put it in the ha-ha, or not put it in ha-ha as a finally funny. If you thought that killing their own and blaming us or hacking off English heads in broad daylight was not enough for the followers of Islam, you would be wrong, very wrong. And in the words of Victor Meldrew, that super nationalist still in the closet, I would say, I simply do not believe it. But here goes. Apparently in the newscast link an Arab is reading a question sent in by a would-be jihadi. The sum of this is that a Sheikh Abu Dimna al-Assad is answering questions on jihad and its forms. And one of the problems a particular jihadi had was that there's a new way of waging war on the West or non-Muslims, and this is to insert an explosive capsule or capsules into your anus and literally blow up. But the question was that in order for this to be more effective, the more explosives you can shove up the better, the wider one's anus apparently has to be. Therefore, in effect, to enlarge this aperture more, is sodomy allowed, and especially does one open one's body to a mujahideen to make it more acceptable to the Quran? The answer was, although sodomy is forbidden by the Quran, virtually anything goes in a holy war, so yup, bugger away, and eventually you will pay the price of literally breaking wind in a devastating fashion. This presenter says, I kid you not, I nearly fell off my seat with this one, then I thought better of it. Backs to the walls, boys, backs to the walls. You have been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozart, and I and the team at World at 8 and Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and a very safe weekend. There was a lack of resources and managerial support for the investigations, initially led by CID, despite formal requests. Detectives without training in child sexual exploitation were used to interview potential victims. There was a lack of managerial oversight for investigations in 2008 and 2009. There was a lack of strategies to respond to frequent runaways which allowed them to return to their abusers. There was recognition that there may have been discriminatory attitudes among police officers towards the victims. But despite the list of acknowledged problems, the police made just one recommendation: that the Force's Public Protection Division should ensure continued participation in Project Phoenix, which has been set up to direct a multi-agency approach. Most European Muslims want Sharia. European Union stripped of AAA credit rating at S&P. 1,000 migrants trying to get into Malila pushed back. Black mob violence blamed on collective mental illness. Cockroaches, the new miracle cure for China's ailments. War on Christmas is more like war on Christians in many parts of the world. Thought for the day: failures? What failures? And finally, it's even on the web now. UK News. Rochdale sex grooming gangs able to flourish due to police errors, say report. A catalogue of police failures allowing sex grooming gangs to flourish in Rochdale, according to a damning leaked report that is published on Friday. Among the failings
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday the 20th of December 2013. Rochdale sex grooming gangs able to flourish due to police errors, says report. Colourblind social workers couldn't see glaring racial issues to Rochdale sex abuse. Can Abramovich make my Christmas wish for the BBC come true? Identified in the 300-page report, untrained detectives were used to investigate child exploitation and there was a lack of resources and oversight. The serious case review was announced by Rochdale Council last year after 9 Asian men were convicted of a systematic grooming and sexual abuse of white girls in Greater Manchester. The findings of the review have resulted in an acknowledgement by Greater Manchester Police that the force has let down a number of vulnerable girls who were groomed by gangs for sexual abuse. An internal police investigation highlighted in the serious case review also found a failure to recognise abuse. The internal police review found that officers failed to challenge a Crown Prosecution Service decision not to prosecute. They were to child sexual exploitation in the region. World at 8, which is a complete waste of time and money if the authorities never truly recognise which section of society is responsible. Colourblind social workers couldn't see glaring racial clues to Rochdale sex abuse. A dangerous inability to recognise the importance of race meant social workers and police missed glaring warning signs about a gang of Pakistani men grooming white girls for sex in Rochdale, an official inquiry has concluded. An obsession with being colourblind meant they failed even to notice the pattern of abuse going on under their noses, it found.